Picture this: a massive church where trees grow through the floor. A theater that once hosted thousands of people, now sitting empty behind boarded windows. A grand city hall standing in the middle of streets that no longer feel alive. Entire blocks of abandoned homes slowly disappearing beneath weeds and time. It looks like the aftermath of a disaster. A war, a hurricane, some sudden catastrophe that forced everyone to leave. But Gary, Indiana wasn't destroyed overnight. In fact, that's what makes its story so strange. Because Gary wasn't built to be a city. It was built to solve a business problem. And once that problem changed, the city changed with it. How does a place built for nearly 180,000 people lose more than half its population, while the industry that created it continues to operate? The answer reveals something far bigger than the story of one American city. It reveals what happens when an entire community becomes dependent on a single purpose. A city made from nothing. Unlike most cities, Gary didn't grow naturally. It was created. In 1906, U.S. Steel wanted a location for what would become one of the largest steel mills in the world. The company found an ideal stretch of land along Lake Michigan, with access to railroads, shipping routes, raw materials, and Chicago's enormous market. There was just one problem. Nobody lived there. So U.S. Steel did something extraordinary. Instead of building a factory inside an existing city, it built an entirely new city around the factory. The city was named after Elbert Gary, the chairman of U.S. Steel. The factory came first. The people came second. Workers arrived from across Europe. Families came from other parts of the United States. Neighborhoods appeared almost overnight. Schools were built. Businesses opened. Churches filled. A city emerged from what had recently been little more than sand dunes. For decades, the formula seemed unstoppable. The problem hidden inside success. Steel was the foundation of modern America, and Gary sat at the center of that industrial machine. The steel mill provided thousands of well-paying jobs. Workers bought homes, raised families, built stable middle-class lives. By 1960, Gary's population had reached nearly 180,000 people. The city looked prosperous. But beneath that success was a hidden weakness. Gary looked like it had a diversified economy. It didn't. It had one customer, U.S. Steel. The restaurants depended on steel workers. The stores depended on steel workers. The contractors depended on steel workers. Even local government depended on steel workers. Almost every dollar flowing through the city could be traced back to the steel industry. As long as steel expanded, Gary expanded. Few people stopped to ask a simple question. What happens if steel needs fewer workers? Not less steel, less labor, because those are very different things. The machine gets smarter. Many people assume Gary collapsed because the steel industry disappeared. It didn't. That's the misconception. The real story is more complicated. Beginning in the second half of the 20th century, steel production became dramatically more efficient. Automation reduced the need for manual labor. Computers coordinated work that had once required large numbers of employees. Modern mills could produce enormous amounts of steel with far fewer workers. Production remained high. Employment did not. Thousands of jobs vanished. And that was the turning point. Gary didn't lose steel. Gary lost the need for workers. Once those jobs disappeared, the city's economic foundation began to crack. When leaving became easy. At exactly the same time, another transformation was taking place across America. The suburbs were growing rapidly. Highways connected communities in ways that had never been possible before. Families no longer needed to live close to factories. People who could afford to leave often did. Businesses followed them. Investment followed them. Tax revenue followed them. The city began shrinking. Gary's decline wasn't driven only by economics. Race played a major role as well. Like many industrial cities of the 20th century, Gary had a long history of segregation and housing discrimination. As manufacturing jobs disappeared, many white residents moved to surrounding suburbs, taking businesses, investment, and tax revenue with them. The city was suddenly facing two crises at once: a shrinking industrial workforce and a shrinking tax base. Each problem made the other worse. The reputation trap. As decline accelerated, Gary developed another problem: its reputation. Crime increased. Vacant buildings multiplied. National media increasingly portrayed Gary as a symbol of urban decay. Once a city becomes famous for decline, that reputation creates its own feedback loop. Businesses hesitate to invest. Families hesitate to move in. The image becomes stronger than reality itself. Eventually, Gary became known less for its steel production and more for its abandoned buildings. The famous City Methodist Church, the Palace Theater, entire streets lined with vacant homes. But these were symptoms, not causes. The real story wasn't about abandoned buildings. It was about an economic model that no longer required as many people as it once had. A city built for another era. Today, fewer than 70,000 people live in Gary. The steel mill still operates. Steel is still produced. Thousands of people still work there, but nowhere near enough to support the kind of city that existed during the industry's peak. Perhaps the strangest symbol of Gary's story is that its most famous son was Michael Jackson. Born in Gary in 1958, he became one of the biggest stars on earth. As his career soared, the city around him entered a decline from which it never fully recovered. Gary wasn't abandoned. It simply became too large for the economic reality that replaced the world it was built for. What Gary really teaches. Gary is often presented as a story about abandoned buildings. But the ruins aren't the real story. The real story is that the steel mill never disappeared. It simply stopped needing as many people. The industry survived. The jobs didn't. And that leaves us with a warning that extends far beyond Indiana. Industries don't have to disappear to stop needing you. And when that happens, an entire city can become a ghost while the factory that created it keeps running. If you want more stories behind the world's biggest successes and failures, like and subscribe. The next story is already waiting.